It was a mystery that broke the hearts of two families, terrified a small community, and touched the world. The murders of two young girls, Abby Williams and Libby German. The case became known as the Delphi Murders. The setting, a small Indiana town of just 3,000 people. On February 13th, 2017, Libby and Abby went hiking. The two teenagers were good friends and had the day off from school. The weather was unseasonably warm, but when Libby and Abby did not show up when they were supposed to get picked up, their families began to worry, and they began to search. Then, the next day, the bodies of these two girls were found, both victims of murder. Then, over the course of the next 5+ years, there were no answers. No arrests, just a series of disjointed clues, like two sketches that looked nothing alike, a video of the suspected killer, and a short audio recording of his voice. Then things got even stranger when police said they were looking for anyone connected to an Anthony Schatz social media account, which was not connected to the male model in the photos, but connected to this man who was arrested for child porn. Then came the arrest of Richard Allen for the murders of the girls, someone who was not on anyone's radar. Now tonight, for the very first time, we get some insight into Allen's defense and what he says really happened to Abby and Libby, a ritualistic killing committed by members of a paganistic religious cult. Tonight, we take a look at this unexpected, shocking twist as we continue to investigate the Delphi Murders.
I'm Vinnie Politan. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This next hour, totally unexpected, completely out of left field. Something no one here at Court TV, no one on this program was anticipating. Today, for the first time, getting some more of the details associated with the murders of Abby and Libby. Let's remember, this case went unsolved for 5 years. More than 5 years. And it was heartbreaking, but it was frustrating. It seemed like this was a case that could be solved. Small town, not a lot of people in and out of the area where these murders took place. You had some witnesses who saw things. You had evidence that was left at the scene. You had people who were there and people who said that they were there. But it took more than 5 years. Now, they investigated several different theories here because anytime you look at this case, there's very suspicious people with some connection to these two girls, including a child pornographer. You've got another man who's got a questionable past. His property is close to where everything is found, but lies about where he was on the day and the times of the murders. So you had things that seemed like obvious places to go, but it was frustrating, but it was confusing at the same time because then we had a video of the actual killer, but they couldn't. And then they had sketches. Well, if you have a video of the killer, why do you need sketches? And then there were two sketches, and they looked nothing alike. And then all this hubbub about some social media profile that they were very interested in, and none of it made any sense. There was no connecting the dots to all these things, but it seemed like there was a lot of information, enough to solve the case. And then Richard Allen appears on the scene. And all of us who've been covering this case and looking at every piece of information that was made public say, well, who's this guy? Where did he come from? Apparently the local CVS. But then we as we went through the pages of some of the affidavits, we learned that this is someone who was there that day and told a member of, I guess it was law enforcement. It wasn't necessarily the people who were investigating the crime, but somebody connected to the park system, that he was there that day. Like immediately said he was there. And then you look at him, and then you look at the guy in the bridge and you say, well, kind of the same build. Maybe we should follow up with this guy. But they didn't until they took another look at the file after 5 years and then said, oh, maybe we need to look at this guy again. And then connected him allegedly to the scene through ballistics, an unshot casing that came out that's found at the scene, a bullet that's found at the scene, that they can connect to a gun that he owns. That's how they're going to connect him. Plus eyewitness testimony, plus the video on the bridge. That's how they're going to try to prove that he's the one that did it. But today, like I said, unexpected, out of left field, 130 pages worth of information in just one of the filings that was released publicly before it was then subsequently sealed from the defense. And the defense is laying out all the information. And the headline in all of this, which we're going to deal with first, is that they are pointing the finger in a very specific direction as to who's responsible for this, and it's not Richard Allen. It's some sort of a religious sect/cult that follow Odinism. And it was a sacrifice. Wow. And they also released in the 130 pages, and we'll go through some of it tonight, what the scene was described like. And they submitted pictures, but those have not been released publicly. But they describe what happened to Abby and Libby and how their bodies were found. And the description does seem very ritualistic. And we had heard murmurs about that. But now, for the first time, the defense, in their motion that they filed and the evidence that they're trying to use to support it, are calling on all the stuff from the investigation that they say, wait a minute, all of this was happening. There was an investigation into this religious cult or sect and the people involved in that. And it was never followed up. And there's members of law enforcement, 3 specific members of law enforcement, who continued down that road and were upset that they weren't following that road. But now here we are. Richard Allen is accused of doing all of this by himself. The defense says he did not, and then they're pointing the finger tonight. So what we're going to do in the next hour is go through some of these allegations. We're going to be on this all week because there's a lot to go through from a lot of different levels. But let's begin with this allegation that this religion has something to do with what happened to Abby and Libby, or everything to do with what happened to Abby and Libby. So this is from the defense motion that they filed in court. Take a look. Members of a pagan Norse religion called Odinism. Now, this is key, I think, hijacked by white nationalists. So they're pointing the finger at white nationalists who, according to the defense, hijacked this religion for their own purposes. Odinism. Ritualistically sacrificed Abigail Williams and Liberty German. That is the headline. Odinism is the pagan religion referenced above, and its followers are called Odinists. Odinists are enamored of Viking Nordic culture. Evidence supports that at the crime scene. These murdering Odinites left behind obvious signatures, symbols in the forms of runes. These runes were formed with sticks, fashioned with tree branches, and painted using the blood of Liberty German. This is sick stuff, folks. This is sick. Sticks and tree branches were deliberately, carefully, and proficiently placed on each girl in a certain arrangement, mimicking certain runes. At least one of the branches appeared to have its end cut off cleanly by some type of tool like an electric saw, providing proof of a preconceived plan. Additionally, the blood of Liberty German was used as the paint to mark a tree with a rune that looks similar to the letter F. With a simple Google search, these runes would be identifiable as one of the many calling cards of this pagan religious cult. Okay, let's dive a little deeper into this. Joining me tonight from Washington, D.C., retired police commander, host of the Profiling Evil podcast, also an expert in cults and types of cases like this. Mike King is with us. Mike, great to see you tonight. This is extremely surprising. Wasn't expecting it. We're going through a lot tonight. But let's start with this description of the sticks and everything else, and this religion, Odinism. My understanding, Odinism goes back a long, long way.
Yeah, I mean, I remember looking at Odinism as part of looking into pagan belief systems, and this Odinism is separate from what you'd see in Judaism or Islam or Christianity. It's a real focus on these Nordic and Germanic gods. So think, for lack of a better example here, think of Marvel Comics, because that Thor, the guy with the big hammer, and his little brother Loki, who caused all the trouble, they were the children of Odin. Their father was Odin, and he is this guy who gave up his eye in search of more wisdom and other kinds of things. And so as people look at these different worship systems, you have people that are looking at monotheistic belief systems, like many Christians do, one God out there, or you have polytheistic religious belief systems that look at many gods. And we really came to know this when we were doing the Who Killed King Tut stuff that I worked on with Greg Cooper. And that polytheistic belief system is actually what led to Tut's death. So you can't discount these kinds of things when you hear them, and you really have to dig in and try to understand them. But you also can't go down a rabbit hole without evidence that's supportive of it. And what we're hearing is some pretty interesting stuff.
And the description of Abby and Libby at the scene, I mean, it seems like there was some level of ritualism here. You're using this young girl's blood to paint some sort of a letter, and you're using these sticks to somehow, I don't know, send some sort of symbol or something. It's really bizarre. Let me read the description of Liberty German, because
okay,
again, this is tough stuff, folks, and it's and really got to be difficult for the families today as well, as they learn all of this. Libby was found at the base of a tree with 4 tree branches of varying sizes intentionally placed in a very specific and arranged pattern. This is the part that, again, gets even tougher, on her naked body. Libby's right arm was placed along the side of her body. One large tree branch had been placed on her left shoulder. This branch was so long that it extended above Libby's head several feet and below her legs for several feet as well. 2 smaller branches formed a V where her legs joined her body near her genitalia, with both sides of the V extending upward towards Libby's head, with one branch extending to the left of Libby's head and the other to the right of Libby's head. The last of the 4 branches extended across Libby's body on a line from her right shoulder to her left shoulder. This 4th tree branch was also connected with the other 3 branches and was placed under both branches that formed the V. Again, difficult. Libby's sliced neck was partially covered by this fourth branch. This is purposeful conduct that is taking place here, Mike. And I guess as an investigator, you could look at the way these branches are placed and try to connect it, if it is connected to some ritual, some group, some sect, or some religion.
Yeah, and I guess the challenge I face in these kinds of things, Vinny, is until we can see, and hopefully we never do, hopefully it's just something that's vetted in that courtroom, but you have to think there are many, many cases out there where inexperienced killers, once they get in the frenzy of killing, they start doing experimentation and other kinds of things that could lead to all kinds of wacky behaviors. So before things get assigned as being tied to Odinism, for instance, or something else, we have to really look at the totality of things and keep in mind, I mean, remember what they were saying in the 1800s about Jack the Ripper's victims and the mutilation that he was doing and the kinds of things that were going on. And there are so many explanations for things like a broken branch that might look like it was surgical, when in effect it might have been a very nice artifact of a really dry piece of wood that broke perfectly smooth. Rare, but possible, versus that young twig that's going to be kind of splintered and really look a little differently. But when you start getting things placed on there and you start seeing the staging that occurs, that starts to tell us a little more, too, about what was going on in the offender's mind. And again, I'm not ready to jump that this is a ritualistic killing versus maybe exploration, but I'm also not willing to discount what we're starting to hear in this thing if they've got truly evidence to back it up and not just theory and supposition.
Yeah, and again, apparently, according to the defense again, because they're the ones digging into the papers and releasing it through this memo, there were 3 investigators who were very much following this line of investigation. Now, let's take a look at the description of Abby's body. Abby was fully clothed. In fact, and this again, another one of these strange facts, Abby was dressed in Libby's sweatshirt and jeans. No blood appeared on Abby's clothing. Abby was found on her back like Libby. However, unlike Libby, Abby's elbows were bent, with her right and left arms both placed on her chest. Abby's left hand and arm near the left side of her face, and her right hand and arm near the right side of her face. Also, Abby's left leg was straight while her right leg was bent at the knee. The murderers, according to, again, the defense is saying there's more than one person doing this. The murderers also placed her bent right leg under her left leg. Above Abby's head were smaller sticks that had been placed over her hair, crudely mimicking horns or antlers. So,
yeah,
that description,
again, is that
it's very posed. I mean, it sounds, the way it's being described, that it is posed. It's not like a murder takes place and this is how the bodies end up. This is specifically done. I guess the question is the reason, and is it in fact consistent with anything connected to Odinists or these white nationalists referred to by the defense that have hijacked Odinism?
Yeah, the challenge that we find too in these kinds of things is, again, we want to try to assign it because our minds just can't wrap around it. But clearly the way that those children were left is symbolic of what was going on in this predator's mind, whether it was a fantasy that he was trying to fulfill, a recreation of an image that he's seen before, or whether he was just working this out and becoming the producer of his own little whacked out film. It's really difficult, or their whacked out film. But I think you're really hitting on something, and that is the suggestion that it might be something more in line with a supremacist movement. And we know that they're speaking about in that document this tie to the prison system and to a really rough culture and other kinds of things. And this is going to really require bringing the two sides together to sort this out. And frankly, if they've got evidence, then the prosecution's going to have to say, hey, this is why investigators excluded it and moved on.
Absolutely. All right, Mike's going to stay with us. We're going to bring in some more guests. We've got a lot more to go through in these allegations by the defense, very specific allegations, and also revealing a lot more about what happened to the victims in Delphi. And coming up next hour.
In Park City, Utah, Corey Richens wrote a children's book to help her children grieve the death of their father. Then she was arrested for his murder, and now Corey Richens has been accused of witness tampering. We have the latest.
Did they catch a glimpse of their father taking his last breath? It's torture to think of. Why did Eric lose his life? Why did the boys lose their father? Was it because of Corey's greed and desire to get life insurance and other assets? If so, that is abhorrent.
A tragedy in the Hollywood Hills. Prominent therapist Dr. Amy Hardwick found fatally injured under her balcony.
Her ex-boyfriend on trial for her murder.
She had had a restraining order against him.
He strangled her, lifted her up over the balcony, and dropped her. He never intended on killing her.
Is this a case of a jilted lover turned obsessive stalker?
The Hollywood Obsession Murder Trial. Trial coverage weekday mornings at 8, 7 Central on Court TV.
That's the voice and an image of the Delphi killer. At least that's what we were led to believe for all these years. This is the person they were looking for, and prosecutors saying that's Richard Allen. I mean, kind of same build, looks like him a little bit. I mean, it's not a super specific shot, but there's more video and audio that investigators have. But now the defense has turned everything upside down with what they filed today. Again, not expected. And they say there's no way one person could have done it, and it wasn't Richard Allen. It was people connected to this Odinism. Take a look. Here's what they are alleging also, that there was a failure to pursue the Odinist links. A particular Odinite from Logansport posted on social media images mimicking the very runes found at the crime scene. A crime scene unreleased and unknown to the general public even to this day. So they're saying this person is posting runes, these images, letters, whatever. He was an Odinite whose son had been dating Abby. An image of two women, either dead or posed, as if they were dead on the ground in what appeared to be a forest. Both women had tree limbs and sticks arranged on their bodies. One of the women had her arm stretched out above her head, similar to the way that Libby's arm was stretched above her head. Wow. Wow, that's huge, right? Okay, let's bring in our guests. Joining us in studio, co-host and producer of Down the Hill, the Delphi Murders podcast, and Court TV senior writer Barbara McDonald. Joining us from Washington, D.C., still with us, retired police commander, host of Profiling Evil podcast, Mike King. And in Chicago, Illinois, criminal defense attorney, host of Defense Diaries, Bob Mata is with us. Thank you, everyone. Barbara, let me start with you. What your initial reaction to all of this, that there is this cult, this religious sect, whatever they are, that's responsible?
Stunned, I think, like everyone else reading the filing today, pouring through it. I thought I knew a lot of the crazy elements of this case. This one kind of came out of left field. It's a bit surprising, but you know, what does this do to the prosecution?
Yeah, well, reasonable doubt is one thing, right? Like, I get it. I understand the game that the defense plays. But this is very specific. We're not naming names, but they're naming names in their papers. Like they're naming specific people.
And at least one of those names has been talked about many times in many of the groups. I mean, he wasn't unknown to people following the case. But yeah, there's a lot of details here that people have not known. My concern is people reading this saying, aha, this is what happened. This is fact. This is from one side.
Yeah, well, first of all, it comes from the defense side. And like I always tell you folks, bring your salt, like a big grain of it every time. But, you know, it is what it is. It's going to be part of this case from this point forward. Bob Mata, let me ask you, you see, here's what happens, and we're covering another case with an alleged conspiracy up in Boston involving a police conspiracy. I always look at those cases and I say, okay, what is the other side saying? But then I look at it and I say, well, what if everything was flipped around? Like, let's say the person the defense is pointing the finger at was actually indicted and charged with this. Would there really be enough, and would everybody be pointing the finger at the person who's actually charged? That's just the way I look at it. What's your reaction, Bob, to this? Is this defense just kind of, you know, causing some hay? Or do you think they're going to get inside that courtroom and specifically name names and have this jury scratching their heads like, wait a minute, somebody else did this and we know who did it?
Yeah, I'm well versed in Karen Reed, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And much like Barbara, my head exploded when I read this morning. I actually was messaging with Barbara. I'm like, have you seen this thing? So look, this is not just defense lawyering, and the thing that makes it different, we're talking about a 136-page document with receipts. Okay, and we have affidavits from law enforcement in this thing. This isn't just some whole cloth theoretical thing. Now, of course, the state is going to have the opportunity to respond, and I'm assuming that they're going to. I don't. Look, as far as McClellan goes, it's a tough gig. Like responding to this, it's a tough gig, you know, because like the prosecutor has some issues that came up in this, in terms of not disclosing things in a timely manner. And I think that, you know, he's going to have to answer for those things.
And I get it. That's, you know, that becomes a legal battle with the judge, what evidence comes in, what doesn't come in, et cetera. I'm only interested in one thing on this show, which is the truth, trying to figure out the truth, which is what prosecutors should be focused on as well. Mike King, let me ask you, is there any reason, like, if the evidence is leading to these Odinites, is there any reason for law enforcement to protect the Odinites? Would we have to see if the investigators are Odinites? Would we have to, I mean, I don't get it. Like, this was the highest profile case they were ever going to have in Delphi, Indiana, by far, right? You've got all these agencies working on it. Why on earth, if this is a valid lead, would they not follow up on it?
As you know, as a case lead investigator, you often know things about the investigation that other people involved in the investigation may not know about, especially if they're from the outside. Maybe like a trooper that picks up a piece of really good information and wants to share it up. And sometimes people really get focused on something and they're a dog on a bone that can't let go of it, and they create a theory before they really have facts. So they spend all their time trying to prove that they were right, and they actually become a detriment to the investigation. So that's really the mission ahead, I believe, for the prosecution, is to be able to say, these things were vetted, this is what really happened. And we're kind of seeing an inkling, I think, even in one of the news reports I read today, where they reached out and the prosecution is saying, nah, the FBI didn't quite say what's being alleged in the document. Heck, I don't know, Vinny, but all I know is that this is really good that it's coming out, and that their hand is being forced to say, we looked at it and here's why it was excluded. And if you got to look into their backgrounds to say, hey, they're not Odinists or they're not part of this conspiracy, by golly, you got to do it. But I think Bob was right. The first thing I thought of too was Karen Reed. If I could just make everybody hate the criminal justice system and disbelieve it and have no faith in it, I might have won already.
Right. I get it. Okay. Now let's get to the real meat of the allegation here. Again, failure to pursue the Odinist links. Evidence known to the Unified Command. Now, the Unified Command is not part of the Odinists. This is part of the investigators, okay? These are the investigators trying to solve the case. Included the fact that fellow Odinites, blank and blank, we're not naming names, were close friends as late as January 21st, 2017. However, that friendship ended very abruptly in February of 2017. The schism in their friendship resulted from a fight that occurred between blank and blank in February of 2017, where he and blank were in the woods near a river conducting a ritual. One of them said or did something the other did not agree with, and they no longer talked to each other. The river was near blank's house. In 2019, the Unified Command, again, the investigators in this case, learned that in a totally different conversation with his ex-wife, according to police reports, blank told his ex-wife that blank and his people killed Abigail Williams and Liberty German because one of their mothers was mixing with other people outside the mother's race. And that's how we get to the link of the white nationalist hijacking of Odinism. Barbara McDonald, what do you think of this? This is very specific. We're not naming names. The defense does. But it seems like you've got a potential admission. There's a little double hearsay going on here,
right.
but you could bring those people in.
Absolutely, and one would hope that they were talked to already and will be again.
They had 5 years to do all this, right?
Yeah, and you know, we've heard how many tips they've gotten in this case and how many people they've investigated and how many states they've traveled to in their investigation. I certainly hope that they have something to say about this. This case, it just sort of feels like it's jumped the shark a bit at this point.
Okay. Bob, to me, this is some form of an admission here, right? This is an admission to the ex-wife that blank and his people committed this murder. How does that evidence come in? Like, who has to testify to that? Because that would be more than reasonable doubt in this case.
No question. Well, they're going to have to call in the ex, and they're going to have to get it in, and it's going to be a statement against interest. I mean, it's going to fall within the hearsay exception. If he said it to her, it is double hearsay. But you know, if it's a statement against interest in terms of, because the assumption is that he was involved as well, right? So even because it sounds like because they're basically naming 4 guys.
Can the defense subpoena these 4 people and put them on the stand?
Absolutely.
So that's what should happen, right? If they believe this is who did it, that's what the defense should be.
100%. And on top of that, in Indiana, they could depose them. Like, we don't have that advantage in Illinois in criminal cases to depose witnesses unless it's a death penalty case. Like, I would have the subpoenas out to all of these guys, and I would be grilling them. So, I mean, they have that advantage in Indiana, and I'm assuming that the state is not going to be happy about them coming in. But I mean, the defense is going to have to do what they have to do in order to try to flesh this out. You know, I mean, this is 136 pages, Vinny. This is a lot.
Yeah, but and again, Mike, on the front end, this all should have been done, right? Like everything we're talking about doing now should have been done and may have been done. We don't know. We don't know. This is all we have to deal with tonight. I talked about the grain of salt when the defense has the theory, right? No offense, Bob. No offense. It's just I was a prosecutor. And this is the way I see the world. Another grain of salt when we have a statement from an ex-spouse. Do you trust the ex-spouses?
Who, me?
Mike. I'm sorry, Mike. I was going to Mike on that. I'm sorry, Mike.
Oh, no, you know, I mean, it's a mixed bag. And I guess that's where it's going to really have to come out what the motivation was for doing it, what she's been like during this period where she's not part of his life, and then whether they can get over the legal challenges of whether she's reliable or not. And, you know, I mean, this part of me that's the investigator, Vinny, goes back to the idea, if these murders were motivated because of a mixed race relationship, I suspect there are a whole lot more mixed race relationships going on in that county and in that part of the country And why haven't we seen a whole batch of murders happen, and if that was the motivation? So I always kind of go back to well, it's possible, but how probable is it based on what we're learning? And that always kind of bugs me. And I always think about an interview I had with Richard Ramirez, if you remember that guy, the Night Stalker. I was sitting with him, and I said, Richard, do you really believe in Satanism? And he smiled, and he said, that was an afterthought the first time around, but then it became good business.
Wow. All right. Everyone stay where you are because the plot thickens, because the allegations aren't just that the killers were practicing Odinism, but also the prison guards. What?
On Tuesday, March 3rd, 2020, Sydney killed her best friend, her mother.
The shock remains in this Wallhaven neighborhood of Akron.
Why? Why did that happen?
An Ohio woman pleads insanity in the stabbing death of her mother.
This is not a case about who did it. These lies were built and controlled by Miss Powell.
The voices are getting louder.
This is going to be quite a case.
The Mother Stabbed Murder Trial. Live coverage weekday mornings at 8, 7 Central on Court TV.
We had gathered evidence to formulate a PC that we submitted to the court, and the judge did find probable cause for an arrest of Richard Allen. He's been charged with 2 counts of murder for the murder of Abigail Williams and Liberty German.
And that was a moment celebrated, right? Oh, finally, the case was solved. Well, now the defense is throwing a big twist in everything, saying there's these Odinites who are following Odinism, who are actually responsible. But it gets even thicker than that. It's not just the murder. Take a look at this. This is from, again, from the defense. Odinites in the Westville Correctional Facility guarding Richard Allen. The evidence shows that during his pretrial incarceration at Westville Correctional Facility, Richard Allen has been monitored, intimidated, and mentally abused by correctional officers who are also members of the Odinite cult. 2 of those correction officers boldly wore patches on their Department of Corrections uniforms that proclaimed, "In Odin we trust," along with another patch displaying symbols of Odinism. Are you kidding me? Let me read it. Let me read the other one also. I'm going to get that in. Normally, corrections officers were within earshot of every conversation between Richard and his attorneys and between Richard and his wife, close enough that Richard would have to be worried about any conversation with his attorneys and with his wife being overheard by those corrections officers. Corrections officers even required that Richard Allen be positioned facing the window where corrections officers were videotaping the attorney visits with the handheld camcorder. The positioning of Richard Allen's body would allow the corrections officers to videotape Richard Allen's mouth as he talked to his attorneys. Richard would therefore not be able to privately discuss anything with his attorneys, such as, this is it, because remember there's an alleged confession here. The guards are telling me that my wife and family will be killed unless I call my wife and tell her that I killed those girls. And they have that as evidence against him. Wow. Barbara McDonald, Mike King, Bob Motta back with us. Bob, what are your thoughts about this? This looks like it's going to be the attack on the confession.
It blew my mind.
Is there anything normal about videotaping attorney-client meetings? I've never heard of that before.
No, frankly, I was in Delphi in Carroll County Courthouse for that hearing. And, because at that point they were trying to get Allen moved out of the facility because he's being held pre-trial, which is very unusual, in a prison as opposed to a jail. His lawyers were trying to get him out. And they ended up at that hearing, that's when this bombshell about these confessions came out. And obviously, everybody in the courtroom was like, we were like, oh my God, what is happening here? So to have this kind of information come out, and I immediately thought, okay, well, what is the context in which the statements were made in terms of the phone call between Richard Allen and his wife? Are they taking things out of context? What was the tone? So this gives us the other side of what was going on with Allen, because they had testimony on there where they admitted that they were using a camcorder, and they were saying it was for the safety of his attorneys and for the guards that were in the room, that they were filming him. So when we see this and then we hear this allegation, which is stunning, a stunning allegation in terms of these guys wearing patches and being like known Odinists, like, and they're the ones that are guarding this guy. Man, I've never seen anything like it, Vinny. Like these allegations, if they're going to get fleshed out, are just bombshells. And it's an absolute explanation in my estimation, and it's going to get vetted. Look, I mean, like you said, this is a defense coming with a motion with some incredibly powerful statements that are going to get vetted at a Frank's hearing. And if it turns out to be true, this case is absolutely turned upon its head, because the biggest and strongest evidence that they have right now are those confessions.
Right. Yeah. Barbara, you were out there. And I mean, did you bump into any Odinites?
Not that I'm aware of, but I've
Was
heard,
it a thing?
I've heard of different groups that perhaps have some off-center beliefs that operate in the area. I've certainly heard that in connection with this case before, but I've also heard from a lot of different investigators who've been connected to the case in various ways that that was all vetted and discounted.
Mike King, we only have about a minute left here. I can't imagine that anyone in uniform is allowed to put patches of anything other than your uniform on there. It should be provable one way or the other. But it seems like it's the attorneys who were saying they saw this.
I have to agree with you, Vinny. I was really saddened and shocked if, in fact, they're allowing that to go on a uniform that would be standardized. And I think that's going to be an easy one to either prove or disprove by the other correctional officers, by what the command staff says and what the policy says. But if the defense says, hey, I witnessed it, that's going to be a little challenging for them to get over too.